Charter Local Edition with your host, John MacDonald.
Welcome. We are visiting today with Senator Dick Barrett from Missoula. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you.
So tell everybody who may not know a little bit about your background and how long you've served in the Montana legislature.
I've been in the Montana legislature for 8 years, or 4 sessions so far, and I have one more left before I'm term limited in the Senate.
And you did 2 sessions in the House?
2 in the House.
1 so far in the Senate?
1 so far in the Senate.
And 1 more to go?
Yeah.
And you are retired, I understand, but what did you do in Missoula before? You were at the university for a while.
I taught at the university in the economics department for 37 years, from 1970 to 2007.
Okay. And I know that both when you were on the House side and in the Senate side, you served on a couple of the very important Senate and House tax committees. Tell folks a little bit about the importance of those and kind of some of the work that you did there.
Well, the tax committees are, as the name implies, important in determining tax policy and legislation regarding tax policy. They also have an important role in terms of estimating the revenue that's available to the state, so that when we go into session and we have to come out with a balanced budget, one of the important things that the tax committee does is estimate how much revenue is going to be available to spend, so that, and then the spending is tailored to that amount of revenue, and then we can go home with a balanced budget.
And we're at the Montana League of Cities and Towns meeting here in Bozeman, and
Right.
so obviously a big issue for every city and town in Montana is the adequacy of funding at the local level. Let's talk a little bit about that and where that's at right now.
Okay. I think there are 2 big issues out there with respect to funding local government. And one is the fact that in the past, the legislature restricted the amount of revenue that local governments could raise. There's a formula for it. And basically what the formula says is that that a local government can increase the amount of revenue by a percentage which is 1/2 the rate of inflation that's occurred in the past. That creates a potential adequacy problem because it means that revenue can't quite keep up with inflation. So that formula and how it works, which is somewhat complicated, is one of the issues in adequacy. The other issue in adequacy is the local governments are pretty much confined to property taxation. And one of the things that they're definitely interested in having is some kind of other source of revenue. One of the things that is mentioned most frequently is the idea of a local option sales tax, which is just a sales tax that that folks in the city or the county or whatever vote on whether they want to have it or not. We have local option sales taxes in Montana, but they're only for resort communities.
And I know during the last session there was an effort again, and I know it's occurred in the past, to pass some sort of a local option authority bill. There was no success in the 2015 session.
There has never been, no local option tax, general local option tax has been successful. As I say, there have been, we do have the resort tax, and we've tinkered with that. And I think to some degree over the past 8 years, I've seen several bills that end up expanding the authority. Local governments in resort areas have gained a little bit more flexibility.
Right. And there was also an effort this last year, and I don't recall where it ended, to reduce that dependency or that tie with the rate of inflation. Talk about that. If I recall, there wasn't a lot of success with that.
No, that has not been successful. That has been one of the things I think that local governments have talked about, is trying to maybe allow revenue to rise by the full amount of inflation, or even if they could get 3/4 of the amount of inflation. Any adjustment in that inflation correction factor would be helpful to them, I suppose, in generating more revenue. Their problem right now is, as I say, that their costs for existing services, I'm not talking about adding new bells and whistles or new services or anything like that, but their costs for existing services tend to go up like everything else at the rate of inflation,
and
their revenue can't keep up with that.
Yeah.
They do Local governments do have some kinds of mechanisms that they can use to raise funds, like special districts. Missoula, as you know, has formed some special districts that allow them to raise revenue that's outside of that revenue cap. But so far, that revenue cap that's driven by half the rate of inflation has not been changed, and there doesn't look like any indication that it's going to be changed anytime soon.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your work on the interim transportation and revenue committee. Tell us a little bit about what's the responsibility that committee is charged with, and what specific issues you're looking at during this interim.
Well, every interim committee has certain agencies that it's responsible for sort of overseeing during the interim between sessions. And so one of our functions is simply to oversee the Department of Transportation, the Department of Revenue, and the State Tax Appeal Board. And that oversight, generally speaking, involves receiving reports from them, finding out what's going on there, finding what kinds of emerging legislative issues might be coming from those agencies, and also to review their rulemaking. The legislature has a pretty active interest in seeing whether the rules reflect what it is that the legislation did. So that's one thing we do. The other thing we do is we study emerging or ongoing issues in tax and transportation policy. So that, for example, this time around, we are going to be we're studying the taxation of international corporations that do business in Montana. We're studying issues like how much property of certain kinds of businesses are subject to tax as opposed to not subject to tax, those kinds of things. Normally, interim committees are actually assigned studies by the legislature. There's a bill that goes through the legislature that calls for a study to be performed, and then they're assigned to committees. We don't have any assigned to us this time around, which is a little unusual.
Yeah.
And then the third thing we're doing is we have to produce the original revenue estimate that has to, in November of next year, that will be the opening revenue estimate when the legislative session starts and the budget starts to get built in January of 2017.
Shows there's a lot of work that occurs long before and long after the session itself starts and ends.
Yes, and I think the fact that the Montana legislature meets every other year for 90 days, which shocks some people that come from states where their legislatures are meeting all the time. The fact that we meet every other year for 90 days makes that interim work very important.
Yeah. Well, Senator, I want to thank you for joining us today. We're at the Montana League of Cities and Towns meeting in Bozeman, Montana. We're talking to Senator Dick Barrett from Missoula. Senator, thanks again. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Charter Local Edition has been an exclusive presentation of Charter Communications, providing original programming.